What is the worst special in Splatoon history? Some people might say Inkvac. While it may be the worst special now, it can pull off some very crazy stuff. Some might say Reslider. And while the special has its issues, it is overtuned to the point of being somewhat decent. Others might say Splatoon 1 Ink Strike, but okay, some people are just wrong. The worst special in Splatoon history is actually Splashdown from Splatoon 2. This thing was horrendous. It's not like the triple Splashdown of today. It was mono splashdown. You go up, you stay there for a bit, and you slam down, causing a massive explosion if you landed. Seems fine on paper, but what made it so bad was its main form of counterplay. While you were suspended in the air, the enemy team had the opportunity to shoot you down, and if they managed, your entire special would be cancelled. You'd lose all value. If you were against experienced players, you wouldn't dare use Splashdown in front of them, since the moment they saw you go up, you wouldn't go down. Throughout all of Splatoon 3's history, Hammer has been one of the worst specials in the game. Not the worst, but consistently bottom 3, and its issue lies in its counterplay. You don't rise into the air as a big shining beacon begging to be shot, but when you use Hammer you are still vulnerable, specifically from the sides and from the back. The main form of counterplay is to kill the user. It punishes players who mindlessly use Hammer in the middle of the enemy team with death, but that adds a level of skill expression as using Hammer to the sides of the map or around cover is rewarded. On paper, its counterplay seems completely fair. But all of that means nothing if you can just shoot through the front as well. When no angle is safe, Hammer loses so much of its consistency. Using Hammer's rush mode for too long will get you killed more often than not, and it's not like it's hard to shoot through the front of Hammer. Pretty much every weapon can, especially shooters and splatlings. Heck, it's possible for Splatanas to dash through the Hammer and kill you and survive. I cannot overstate just how easy the counterplay is. Throughout all of Splatoon 2's life, Splashdown stayed as being one of the worst specials in the game. The devs tried to buff it quite a few times. They increased its paint, increased damage to Baller, they increased its vertical hitbox for some reason, they increased its damage to Baller, and they increased its object damage. But none of them worked in making Splashdown a good special, because they ignored Splashdown's main issue, its counterplay. But that was by choice. They clearly knew that this was an issue but couldn't do much about it. You see, Splashdown was actually a really good special in the lower levels of play. Inexperienced players would often struggle to shoot it down, which made Splashdown a pretty powerful special down there. If they buffed Splashdown too much and fixed its main issue, it would become too strong of an option in the lower levels, and so every buff they did had to dance around that issue. There was an attempt to fix Hammer, but it wasn't much. They increased the AoE shockwaves and improved its handling, and nothing else. These are objective buffs that make it more of a threat, but completely miss the point. They seemed to recognise that the rush mode needed a buff, but awkwardly danced around what it was that it needed. Its last buff was almost 2 years ago. They have to know something is up with Hammer, but they're not even trying. Why is that? There is obviously an element of player skill that goes into Hammer's issue, but this can't account for all of it. Players at all levels know how to shoot through Hammer and it will die. This isn't just about skill level, there has to be more to it. When they eventually fixed Splashdown in Splatoon 3, they made it triple Splashdown. They made it spawn 2 extra fists that would also Splashdown so that if you got killed during your special, you could still get some sort of value out of it. Essentially, they kept its counterplay but added a mechanic that made it more consistent, and since then it's been a mid-tier, where it belongs. But they can't do this with Hammer. Splashdown's issue was that it was a pretty high-risk special with basically no reward. In terms of Splashdown's overall pressure, it was totally possible for you to get a quad, but it was also possible for you to die immediately on using it. And so it had a pretty high ceiling, but an incredibly low floor. But assuming you were to get your Splashdown off, realistically you weren't getting anywhere near that ceiling. It was a one-time AoE centered on the player. You could expect anywhere between 0 to 1 kills, so increasing its consistency is fine since the average case of Splashdown is just alright. It took so long to buff, not just because it was a low-level menace, but also because there was no obvious solution. To fix it in Splatoon 3, they had to add a Splashdown to the Splashdown so the Splashdown could Splashdown. That's not an obvious solution, but the solution to Hammer? We all know it. You're thinking it right now, and you've been thinking it since the start of Splatoon 3. Why don't they just make it block shots from the front, guaranteed? It's so obvious, so why hasn't it happened yet? Compared to Splashdown, Hammer has the same pressure floor, as in you could just die immediately, and it has the same ceiling, because you can get a quad and win the game, but the average case of Hammer? Hammer lasts continuously for 7.5 seconds after the nerfs. And oh yeah, they nerfed this thing for some reason. Don't ask me why, I don't know, but throughout its entire duration, you have access to this great big one-shot hitbox that you can move about. It's a lot easier to get a multi-kill with hammer. You don't need the stars to align and for 3 players to be dumb enough to crowd around a splashdown user. You can take hammer from one player to the next, which increases its average case. But hammer isn't just a kill bot. It is able to destroy all bombs and projectiles it comes into contact with over its entire duration. Not only can hammer break bombs and stop people from shooting the zone, it can also block entire specials. Put hammer in front of a Zuka and it can block the entire thing. It can also block entire inkjets. This is stuff that it can kind of already do now, but is so inconsistent that only the crazy or desperate even try. Give hammer full frontal protection and these wouldn't just be cool theoreticals. These would be consistent and reliable tactics you could employ when you see these specials. Even ones that couldn't be blocked before, like Crab, would shudder at so much of the thought of a hammer running at them. I wouldn't be surprised if the reason this buff hasn't happened yet is because the devs are scared of hammer meta. Okay, look, I know this sounds incredibly dumb. I unironically said hammer meta. I'm sorry, I get it, but hear me out. Because this has happened before. When Splatoon 3 was released, Inkjet was not a terrible special, but it wasn't the greatest either. With the removal of ink armor as well as charges and Crab being really popular, it had some consistency issues that put it bottom 3-ish specials. Seriously. It had pretty similar issues to hammer in that it was really easy to shoot out of the sky. Not only are you a slow moving easy target, but fun fact, the hitbox of the jet is bigger than that of a normal inkling, making it literally easier to land shots on them. Against experienced opponents you wouldn't last long with inkjet, but then it received 2 buffs. One really important one was that the boost you could get by pressing the jump button made you jump higher. So much higher that this became an effective dodge tool. It kept its main form of counterplay but added a level of skill expression letting you dodge important shots to keep your jet alive. This patch also increased its AoE to ungodly levels. Together these buffs helped propel Jet into being the best special in the game. It didn't add any extra functionality, it didn't increase its pressure floor, you could still get shot out of the sky, nor did it increase its ceiling. You could still get a quad. All it did was make it more consistent, making the average case of you surviving long enough to get 1 or 2 kills more likely to happen. So is hammer meta a real threat if this buff happened? It's hard to say when we're talking theoreticals. There are some weapons that see play despite having hammer. I shudder to think of how good they'd be with a functional special instead. Especially since there are some good main weapons out there with some good subs that don't see play because, well, hammer is bad. So should hammer get this buff? Yes, of course it should. Maybe I'm biased in this. Inkbush Nouveau is my second favourite weapon, just behind Inkbush Nouveau, but is also my second most hated weapon, right behind the Minster Calculator. But I hate it so much because hammer being so bad makes this weapon feel like so much missed potential, especially given that hammer exists in the same game as some really good aggressive specials like Splashdown and Kraken.